Power does not announce itself with noise. It moves quietly, deliberately, and often long before the world realizes something has changed. Across history, the rise and fall of civilizations has rarely begun with a single dramatic event. Instead, it has started with subtle shifts: armies repositioned, borders reinforced, symbols relocated, resources redirected. To those living in the moment, these movements appear routine, even mundane. But when viewed through the long lens of time, they reveal a hidden language spoken only by those who hold power, and understood only after the consequences unfold. Long before written history, early human groups learned that survival depended not only on strength, but on positioning. The location of water, the control of migration routes, the occupation of high ground. These decisions determined who endured and who vanished. Power, in its earliest form, was geographic. Those who controlled space controlled life itself. As populations grew and societies formed, this instinct did not disappear. It evolved. The movement of people became the movement of armies. The defense of territory became the projection of influence, and every shift carried meaning. The first great empires understood this language instinctively. In ancient Mesopotamia, rulers did not simply conquer land, they rearranged it. Cities were built along rivers not only for agriculture, but for visibility and dominance. Roads were carved into the earth to bind distant regions to a single center of control. When Assyrian kings marched their armies, the goal was not always immediate destruction. Often it was presence. To be seen was to be feared. To arrive without resistance was to communicate inevitability. Egypt mastered this art differently. The Nile was not merely a river, it was a spine of power. Fortresses along its banks were signals, not defenses. They announced permanence. The pharaoh's authority flowed outward from the river, carried by grain shipments, religious rituals, and monumental architecture. When Egypt expanded beyond its natural borders, it did so cautiously, establishing garrisons and trade routes before open domination. Power moved first, control followed later. In Asia, the logic repeated itself on a vast scale. The Qin dynasty unified China not just through force, but through standardization. Roads, weights, measures, language. These were movements invisible to the battlefield, yet far more enduring. When armies marched, they followed infrastructure already laid in anticipation of control. Power had shifted long before swords were drawn. By the time resistance appeared, the outcome was already decided. The Roman Empire elevated this concept to a science. Roman legions did not wander, they advanced along roads engineered for speed and supply. Camps were built before battles, not after. Borders were reinforced not where threats were strongest, but where symbols mattered most. A wall was not just a barrier, it was a message. Rome's true strength was not its armies, but its ability to signal dominance through motion. When legions repositioned, provinces fell silent. Everyone understood what it meant when Rome's giants began to move. Yet power is never static. It is reactive, adaptive, and deeply psychological. When Rome stopped moving, it began to weaken. Borders hardened into lines of fear rather than confidence. Garrisons became defensive rather than assertive. The language changed. Where movement once signaled control, stillness now signaled uncertainty, and the world noticed. The medieval era did not abandon this language, it refined it. Empires fragmented, but power continued to travel. Castles rose not merely for protection, but for visibility. A fortress on a hill was a statement, visible for miles. It told travelers who ruled the land before a word was spoken. Kings relocated courts strategically, shifting centers of gravity to manage rivals and allies alike. The movement of a capital could alter the fate of entire regions. Trade routes became arteries of influence. Whoever controlled them controlled wealth, ideas, and loyalty. When the Silk Road flourished, cities along its path became centers of power without ever raising armies. When those roots shifted, those cities faded into obscurity. Power had moved on, silently, leaving ruins behind. In the Islamic Golden Age, power moved through knowledge. Libraries, observatories, and universities became instruments of influence. When scholars traveled, ideas traveled with them, reshaping distant societies. This too was a form of repositioning, less visible but profoundly transformative. Control of knowledge became control of the future. The age of exploration did not begin with discovery, it began with preparation. Shipyards expanded, maps improved, ports fortified. Nations did not announce their intentions. They invested, adjusted, and waited. When fleets finally sailed, the world interpreted it as ambition. In reality, the decision had already been made years earlier. Power had shifted inward long before it projected outward. Empires rose and fell faster now, but the pattern remained unchanged. The British Empire mastered global repositioning through naval dominance. Ships did not merely protect trade, they shaped it. Bases were established not where conflict existed, but where it might one day emerge. Coaling stations, ports, and canals formed a web of influence spanning oceans. Britain's true power lay not in conquest, but in anticipation. The 20th century compressed this language further. Industrialization accelerated movement. Railways allowed armies to reposition in days rather than months. Factories became strategic assets. Power now shifted not just across geography, but across economies. When production moved, influence followed. When resources concentrated, dependence grew. World conflicts did not erupt spontaneously. They were preceded by years of silent adjustments. Alliances formed, forces redistributed, technologies tested. Observers saw diplomacy. Historians later recognized preparation. Power was speaking, but few understood the dialect. In the modern era, the language has grown even more abstract. Power no longer relies solely on territory or numbers. It moves through signals, deployments, exercises, alliances, economic pressure. A single repositioning can ripple across continents, altering decisions in distant capitals. The movement itself becomes the message. What makes this language so effective is its ambiguity. It allows denial. It avoids commitment. It creates uncertainty without escalation. Those who understand it can shape outcomes without confrontation. Those who ignore it often react too late. History shows us this truth repeatedly. By the time events become visible, the balance has already shifted. Empires do not collapse when they are challenged. They collapse when they stop adapting, when they failed to move in response to a changing world. Stillness is not peace, it is vulnerability. Today, we live in an age where power moves faster than ever before, yet remains rooted in ancient instincts. Geography still matters. Presence still intimidates. Symbols still influence behavior. The tools have changed, but the language has not. When giants shift, they are not reacting to the present, they are shaping the future. To understand the world as it truly is, one must look not at words, but at movement, not at declarations, but at positioning. Power rarely explains itself. It expects to be noticed, interpreted, and respected, and those who fail to read its signals often become footnotes in history. This is not a story of conflict, it is a story of patterns. A story written across millennia by civilizations that learned, through survival and collapse, that the greatest decisions are made quietly. When power moves, it leaves traces, and for those who know where to look, the message is unmistakable. Power leaves traces, but it never leaves instructions. Those who attempt to understand it by listening to speeches or reading proclamations often miss its true direction. The real signals are embedded in logistics, in timing, in the careful placement of strength where it does not yet seem necessary. History rewards those who notice these details early and punishes those who dismiss them as routine. As the modern world took shape, power learned to hide in plain sight. Nation-states emerged from the ruins of empires, carrying with them ancient instincts wrapped in new language. Borders were drawn on maps, but influence extended far beyond them. Military forces were no longer assembled only for immediate action. They became tools of perception. Where forces were stationed mattered as much as their size. A presence in one region could silence uncertainty in another. Movement became diplomacy without words. During the early decades of the 20th century, this silent language intensified. Industrial capacity replaced sheer manpower as the foundation of influence. Factories, shipyards, and energy networks became strategic terrain. Power no longer needed to conquer cities if it could control supply. A nation that could move resources faster than its rivals could dictate outcomes before events even began. By the time the world noticed tension, the structure of advantage was already in place. The global system that followed was not designed for stability, it was designed for balance. Alliances formed not out of trust, but out of calculation. Each repositioning carried layered meaning. When forces trained together, it signaled alignment. When they withdrew, it suggested reconsideration. Silence itself became a message. The absence of movement could be just as intentional as its presence. In this era, giants learned that visibility was power. Large-scale deployments were not only about capability, but about observation. Being seen meant being accounted for. It forced others to react, to allocate attention and resources. Even a temporary shift could alter long-term planning elsewhere. Entire strategies changed in response to movements that never resulted in direct action. But power also learned restraint. Excessive movement could provoke resistance. Predictability could invite challenge. The most effective signals were subtle enough to maintain ambiguity. This ambiguity created space for influence without obligation. It allowed power to shape behavior without revealing intent. Those on the receiving end were left to interpret and often to overestimate. Technology amplified this effect. Satellites, surveillance, and instant communication made movement impossible to hide, but also easier to manipulate. What was shown mattered as much as what was concealed. A visible repositioning could distract from a quieter shift elsewhere. Power became multi-layered, operating simultaneously across physical, economic, and informational domains. The late 20th century demonstrated how quickly the balance could change when movement outpaced understanding. Some powers expanded their reach through networks rather than borders. Financial systems, trade agreements, technological standards. Control was no longer about occupation, but dependency. When infrastructure aligned around a single center, influence followed naturally. Power did not need to move aggressively, it simply needed others to move toward it. Yet history warns that no configuration lasts forever. Every system contains the seeds of its own recalibration. As new players rise, old centers must adapt or risk irrelevance. This is where the language of power becomes most revealing. Established forces begin to reposition not out of strength, but out of caution. Movements become defensive, symbolic, reassuring to allies and unsettling to rivals. The tone changes, even if the message remains unspoken. In moments like these, observers often mistake activity for confidence, but motion can also signal uncertainty. A giant does not move without a reason. Each shift reflects an assessment of threats, of opportunity, of decline or renewal. The question is not whether power moves always, but why it moves now. Throughout history, transitions have followed a familiar rhythm. First comes adjustment, then signaling, then normalization. What once seemed extraordinary becomes routine. The world adapts to the new arrangement, and power settles briefly into a revised balance. But beneath the surface, the process continues. Influence is never finished repositioning itself. This cycle can be seen in every era, when trade routes change, when technology reshapes economies, when populations shift, power responds. Sometimes it leads, sometimes it follows, but it always moves. Those who understand this do not ask what is happening today, they ask what is being prepared for tomorrow. Modern power is deeply aware of history's lessons. It knows that sudden change invites resistance. Gradual repositioning invites acceptance. What appears incremental is often intentional. Small adjustments accumulate until they form a new reality. By the time the shift is undeniable, opposition has already adapted to it. This is why moments of visible movement draw such intense attention. They feel disruptive because they break the illusion of stability. They remind the world that balance is temporary, that influence must be maintained, not assumed. Even the most established powers must occasionally remind others of their reach, not through words, but through presence. Yet presence alone is not enough. Power must also manage perception. Too much visibility can harden opposition, too little can invite challenge. The balance between signaling and restraint is delicate, refined over centuries of trial and error. Those who master it shape the environment in which decisions are made by others. As the world becomes more interconnected, the consequences of movement multiply. A shift in one region can cascade through markets, alliances, and public sentiment elsewhere. Power today operates in a system where every action is observed, analyzed, and interpreted in real time. This makes subtlety more valuable than ever. The loudest moves are not always the most effective. History teaches that the most decisive moments often pass unnoticed. While attention focuses on speeches and events, the real story unfolds quietly through logistics, infrastructure, and positioning. By the time outcomes become visible, the path leading to them has long been established. Understanding this does not require prophecy, it requires perspective. When we step back and view power not as emotion or intention, but as behavior, patterns emerge. The same logic that guided ancient empires still shapes modern systems. The scale has changed, the tools have evolved, but the instincts remain. Giants do not move impulsively. They move when the cost of stillness exceeds the risk of adjustment. Each shift is a calculation rooted in history, experience, and expectation. To read these movements is to glimpse the future before it arrives, not as certainty, but as probability. And this is where the hidden language becomes most powerful. It does not predict outcomes, it narrows possibilities. It shapes what others believe is likely, acceptable, or inevitable. Power rarely forces the future. It nudges it, slowly, until resistance feels impractical. As the world stands at another moment of recalibration, the movements we observe are not isolated events. They are chapters in a much longer story, one written by countless civilizations that learned, often too late, that power speaks loudest when it says nothing at all.
The modern giants of the world operate on a stage both visible and invisible, their movements choreographed across layers of geography, economy, and influence. Cities pulse with the unseen rhythms of power, supply chains that stretch continents, financial networks that tie nations together, communications systems that relay information before events have even fully unfolded. Every repositioning, every calculated pause carries meaning. Those who control these networks hold sway over not just outcomes, but perception itself. Influence is no longer measured in armies alone, but in anticipation, in readiness, in the ability to project strength without confrontation. Yet, the more sophisticated the system becomes, the more fragile it appears. Complexity introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty demands vigilance. The giants of today must navigate not only rivals, but the cascading consequences of their own movements. A misstep in logistics can ripple into economic strain. A poorly timed exercise can spark unintended alarm. Even the quietest adjustment is a negotiation with both reality and perception, where success is measured not in applause, but in stability maintained and threats preempted. History reminds us that power always travels along familiar lines. Geography still matters. Control of strategic choke points, narrow seas, mountain passes, trade hubs remains as decisive now as it was thousands of years ago. Even in a world of satellites and instant communication, physical positioning carries psychological weight. A fleet anchored in a distant port, a garrison stationed on a border, a corporate office placed near critical infrastructure. Each is a statement, a calculated assertion of relevance. The giants move, and the world reads the signals carefully, parsing intention from routine, strategy from habit. In every era, there are those who fail to interpret these signals. Empires have fallen not because of open assault, but because they misread the movement of others. They mistook posturing for hesitation, routine deployment for retreat, subtle signaling for inaction. By the time their error became evident, the adjustment had already been made, the balance irreversibly shifted. History is filled with the quiet disasters of misinterpretation, silent collapses, invisible defeats, lessons learned too late. This principle applies not only to military or political power, but to economic influence as well. Modern trade, energy, and technology flows are arteries of dominance. When a resource is moved, when a policy is enacted, when an alliance is reoriented, the implications extend far beyond the immediate sphere. Markets shift, dependencies form, opportunities vanish. Those who anticipate the movement of these invisible currents gain advantages that can rival and often exceed the effects of traditional power projection. The giants have learned to move in dimensions beyond the tangible, where perception and reality intertwine. Yet, even the most advanced strategies retain echoes of ancient patterns. Timing remains critical, patience is rewarded, impulsivity punished. Whether building roads in Mesopotamia, fortifying Nile banks, or positioning aircraft carriers across oceans, the underlying logic is consistent. Power is amplified by foresight, not force alone. The giants move not to impress the present, but to shape what comes next. Each repositioning is a sentence in a narrative written across decades and centuries, visible only to those who know how to read the signs. And so, the language continues, evolving but familiar. Modern satellites and intelligence reports act as the scouts once stationed on hilltops. Financial leverage replaces fortified walls. Strategic diplomacy echoes the careful placement of garrisons along trade routes. The mechanics change, but the grammar remains. Presence implies control. Absence invites uncertainty. Movement communicates intent, and restraint signals deliberation. To miss the subtleties is to cede the advantage, often without realizing it. History also teaches that no giant remains dominant forever. Every position must be maintained, every adjustment recalculated. Complacency is a slow adversary, eroding influence without drama. Even the most formidable power can decline if it misjudges the rhythm of movement or underestimates the consequences of silence. Civilizations rise and fall not merely because of conflict, but because they failed to read the language that governs the flow of influence. Adaptation is the ultimate measure of survival. In the contemporary era, this hidden language has grown both more complex and more transparent. Globalization links distant regions with speed unimaginable to earlier generations. Movements are observed, analyzed, and interpreted in real time. A shift in one location resonates across continents, prompting reaction and counter-reaction. Yet with this visibility comes the challenge of deception. Those who understand the rules can obscure intent, feint, and misdirect. The giants can appear still while preparing decisive action elsewhere, reinforcing the timeless lesson that presence alone does not equal power. It is the meaning behind movement that counts. Civilizations, large or small, are engaged in this silent dialogue every day. The rise of a new technology, the repositioning of assets, the subtle realignment of alliances are all statements within an ongoing narrative. Power speaks not through proclamations, but through deliberate action, its language written in the ebb and flow of human systems. To read it is to glimpse the trajectory of history before it solidifies into events. And yet, for all its sophistication, the pattern is not a guarantee. Complexity invites error, and error is always a companion of power. Miscalculation can amplify minor issues into crises. Signals misread can trigger unnecessary alarm or misplaced confidence. Even the most experienced observers cannot control how movement will be interpreted by others, nor how quickly circumstances can render a carefully planned adjustment obsolete. The giants move, but the world moves with them, and sometimes against them. What emerges, when seen clearly, is a continuum stretching back through millennia, from the rivers of Africa to the fortresses of medieval Europe, from the roads of Rome to the naval docks of empires. Power has always spoken through placement, through adjustment, through anticipation. Today, that same language plays out on a global scale, in forms both visible and hidden. The principles endure. Presence communicates authority, positioning shapes perception, and movement signals intent. Those who understand these lessons can navigate a world that appears chaotic, but is at its core patterned and deliberate. As we observe the giants of our time, we recognize that their actions are not isolated incidents, but chapters in a story centuries in the making. Each repositioning, each recalibration is part of a rhythm that civilizations have danced to since the earliest humans sought water, territory, and survival. The movements we see today are the continuation of instincts honed over millennia, a testament to the enduring logic of influence and control. To watch carefully is to witness the unfolding of history itself.
The story of power is never truly complete because it is always in motion. Every action taken by giants, every subtle repositioning, leaves traces that shape the decisions of others, creating a feedback loop that stretches across generations. The world we see today is not simply the product of chance or conflict. It is the accumulation of countless adjustments, movements, and anticipations, each one carefully calibrated and often invisible at the moment it occurs. History repeats itself not in the details, but in the underlying rhythm of influence and response, a rhythm that continues to guide the present and foreshadow the future. To understand this is to recognize that power is both tangible and abstract. Armies, fleets, and borders are the visible instruments, but influence flows more quietly through resources, information, alliances, and perception. The giants of the modern era, though encased in technology and instantaneous communication, operate according to instincts honed over millennia. They shift not just for immediate gain, but to set conditions years, even decades ahead. The language of power is anticipatory, designed to constrain what others think possible, shaping behavior before confrontation ever occurs. Yet with sophistication comes vulnerability. The more interconnected and complex the world becomes, the more sensitive it is to misinterpretation. Signals can be misunderstood, intentions misread, outcomes amplified or distorted. Even the most deliberate moves risk unintended consequences, cascading unpredictably through systems that span continents. History is full of examples where the tiniest misalignment, a delay in deployment, a misread economic signal, a misunderstood diplomatic gesture has triggered consequences disproportionate to the initial action. The giants know this, and yet they continue to move, because stillness is often more dangerous than calculated risk. Observing the modern landscape, we see echoes of ancient patterns. Just as early humans once positioned themselves near water, fertile land, and strategic high ground, today's powers position themselves near resources, technological hubs, and economic choke points. Presence still conveys authority, mobility still signals intent, and the careful calibration of influence still determines outcomes before battles or negotiations even begin. The language of power action happened. The language of power action happened. The giants move in a dialogue with history itself, aware that their predecessors' lessons are both guide and warning. The consequences of ignoring this language are evident throughout history. Empires have crumbled, not because they lacked strength, but because they failed to interpret the movements of others or the signals embedded in their own actions. They misjudged the timing, underestimated the consequences, or mistook ritual for irrelevance. The collapse was rarely dramatic, it was cumulative, a quiet erosion of advantage until it became irreparable. Observers decades later recognize patterns that contemporaries missed entirely. The lesson is consistent. Power that cannot move or cannot be understood in motion is doomed to diminish. Yet movement alone is insufficient. Power must be legible, but also restrained, calibrated, and credible. It communicates authority without triggering unnecessary confrontation. It shapes perception without revealing vulnerability. It signals intent without committing prematurely. Giants that move indiscriminately without consideration of consequences reveal more than they intend. Those that fail to move, even when circumstances demand it, invite erosion. The language of influence is subtle, layered, and precise, mastered only through experience, patience, and observation. In the modern era, this mastery has extended beyond territory and armies into finance, technology, and culture. Global connectivity has made the repercussions of movement instantaneous, amplifying both opportunity and risk. Strategic positioning now involves economic flows, information networks, technological dominance, and even public perception. A shift in one domain resonates through others, creating ripples that can reshape alliances, markets, and public sentiment. The giants move across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and those who fail to perceive the full pattern risk being swept aside by forces they cannot see. And yet, despite all the tools, systems, and technologies, the underlying principles remain remarkably consistent with those of antiquity. Presence communicates authority, positioning shapes perception, movement signals intent, restraint signals deliberation, anticipation precedes action. History is not simply a record of what has happened, but a guide to interpreting the signals that will determine what is possible. The giants of today act within a framework created by millennia of human experience, adapting the lessons of rivers, roads, walls, and trade routes to a world of satellites, data, and global finance. Ultimately, the language of power is a reminder that history is alive, ongoing, and decipherable for those who look carefully. Empires, nations, corporations, and individuals all participate, consciously or unconsciously, in a dialogue that spans continents and centuries. The patterns of influence repeat themselves, subtly transformed by technology and circumstance, but fundamentally the same as those that governed the rise of early cities, the expansion of empires, and the management of trade routes. To ignore these patterns is to invite miscalculation. To observe them and understand them is to glimpse the currents that shape the future. The lesson is simple yet profound. The most decisive moments are often the quietest. The shifts that alter history rarely happen in headlines or proclamations. They occur in positioning, preparation, and subtle adjustment, long before the world notices. Giants move, and those who read the traces recognize the significance before outcomes manifest. Knowledge of these movements confers advantage, foresight, and the ability to navigate uncertainty. As we watch the giants of our time, we are witnessing history in motion. The echoes of the past resonate in their actions, and the principles that governed ancient empires continue to guide modern power. The patterns, though concealed in complexity, remain intelligible to those willing to observe. The language is subtle but persistent, its grammar immutable, its effect profound. Power moves, and through its motion, the future is written. This is the enduring story of influence, authority, and survival. From the earliest human settlements to the sprawling networks of today's global powers, the narrative is consistent. Movement matters, positioning matters, and understanding the hidden language of power determines who thrives and who fades. The giants of the world may change in shape, scale, and technology, but their dialogue remains timeless. Every adjustment, every deployment, every subtle signal is part of a continuum stretching across millennia, a continuum that continues to unfold before our eyes, shaping the world, defining history, and silently instructing those who know how to see. In the end, the lesson is clear. Watch the giants, read their movement, and understand that power speaks most eloquently when it does not raise its voice. The world responds, history records, and those who comprehend the subtle shifts gain insight into forces far greater than any individual, far more enduring than any headline, and far more consequential than any single event. Giants move, the language is silent, and for those who pay attention, the message is unmistakable.